Hello, I'm Jonothan Earnshaw, former lead for the NHS Abdominal Aortic Aneurysm Screening Programme. This is a reprise of a presentation concerning the effectiveness review of aortic aneurysm screening, given on behalf of the review team to the NSC at its recent meeting. Full details of the review will be available on the gov.uk website. This is a poignant moment for me. I was appointed as a consultant surgeon in 1991 in Gloucester, where Brian Heather had already started a local population screening programme for aneurysms in men. When I was Secretary of the Vascular Society in 2008, I gave evidence to the Secretary of State about aneurysm screening and its effects, which encouraged the Labour government of the time to fund the national programme in the 4 countries in the UK, which continues to this day. So it's a particular pleasure to me, as it will be to everybody who's been involved in the screening programme, to find out if it's all been worthwhile. The aim of the screening programme review was to look at the programme over the last decade, when it's been fully rolled out across the 4 nations since 2013. We gathered together a group of people, largely based on the 4 nation screening teams, but also with other key stakeholders, to work out how to do the effectiveness review. It would have been easy just to look at deaths from ruptured aneurysm and see whether that number had been reduced, but we all agreed it was much more complicated than that, for reasons I'll explain in a minute. And therefore we had to have a much larger review, looking at it from various different points. We obtained data from the 4 nations, which were able to be produced the report for the NSC. We got data from a number of different places. The bespoke programme to collect all the screening statistics was really useful, but we also used national statistics from Scotland and the UK for looking at aneurysm deaths and operations. The Vascular Society of Great Britain and Ireland also helpfully provided us information from the National Vascular Registry, and we looked at some other softer parts such as cost effectiveness and quality of life from experts in the field. The idea was to produce a comprehensive report. Something else we need to talk about before we look at the results, and that's what was happening to aneurysms at the time. It's well known that aneurysms peaked in the 1990s, when about 20 years after peak smoking in the country. You can see here that the rupture rates in men in light blue dots and in women in light pink were reducing when the aneurysm screening programme was actually funded. So there was already a reduction in prevalence. And yet at that time, aneurysm screening remained cost effective and therefore worthwhile. So here are the results. Over the 10 years that we looked at, from 2013 to 2023, nearly 3.5 million men were offered screening, and somewhere between 75 and 85% of people turned up and received a scan. The vast majority of those scans were definitive, and the men were given the results on the same day. Most men were reassured that they didn't have an aneurysm, and most aneurysms that were detected were small. You can see on the graph on the left the size of the aneurysms detected, and there were only a few large ones. One interesting finding is that the prevalence of aneurysms reduced over the decade. The graph at the top right here shows the reduction in prevalence over 10 years, from around about 1.2%, that's 12 aneurysms for every 1,000 men scanned, down to around about 0.8%, only 8 aneurysms per 1,000 men scanned. And yet, because of the very large number of men that were imaged, nearly 8,000 men with a large aneurysm were referred for treatment during the 10 years of the trial. This slide shows perhaps the one down part of the investigation. A number of years ago, there was a target set that men should be operated within 8 weeks of the diagnosis of a large aneurysm. And it's truth to be told, that the vascular units in all 4 countries have found some difficulty in being able to achieve this. Excuse me. The pandemic and other effects have certainly not helped. The good news is that the targets have been adopted by the Vascular Society, and then therefore vascular surgeons will be working to try and improve this to make sure that men who have an aneurysm detected are treated as quickly as possible. These are results from the National Vascular Registry and show what happened to the elective aneurysm surgery that's done in the UK. You can see here that the proportion of men who come from the National Screening Programme, the light blue at the bottom of the graph here, is gradually increasing. Currently, around about 1/3 of elective aneurysm surgery that's done in the UK is done on screen-detected aneurysms, and that figure is projected to rise to nearly 50% over the next few years. This is probably the most important slide in the presentation. And it looks at the number of ruptures that have occurred and deaths from ruptured aneurysm. Looking at figure 10 on the right-hand side to start with, this looks at mortality after elective aneurysm repair on the National Vascular Registry and mortality after ruptured aneurysm repair. Elective aneurysm mortality, as you would expect, will be low. So those are the small bars to the left, and that's remained unchanged during the decade. Mortality after surgery for ruptured aneurysm is obviously higher, and you'll see that in the first 5 years of the study, around about 300 deaths occurred every year from ruptured aneurysm in the UK. In the second half of the study, this is reduced down to around 150. That's a 50% reduction in the number of ruptured aneurysms treated by UK vascular surgeons over the decade. On the left-hand side, the graph looks at these numbers in a bit more detail. The top light grey line is all aneurysms and shows the reduction from around about 950 down to around about 500 over the decade, a reduction of just under 50%. Whereas the black line just below it looks at men outside the screening ages, so outside 65 to 74 years, and you'll see a slightly lower reduction in that group. The biggest reduction in the number of repairs done is in the group age 65 to 74 years. Those are the group targeted by screening, although some of those won't have been screened. That reduced the number of ruptured aneurysm repairs has reduced from about 350 a year down to around about 100. That is a 2/3 reduction. And the difference between the 50% reduction in all ages and the 2/3 reduction in screen detected years is the actual effect of screening rather than the effect of the general reduction in prevalence of aneurysms. Turning to national data, this again shows finished consultant episodes based on coding. This includes men who didn't have a surgery for their ruptured aneurysms, but attended hospital and died there. And again, you can see a roughly 50% reduction over the 10 years. And this is death certificates where aortic aneurysm rupture is mentioned as a cause of death. And you'll see again, this is reduced from around 1% of all death certificates at the start of the decade down to just under 0.6% by the end of the decade. Again, showing a reduction in the number of people died from ruptured aneurysm. And finally, let's look at some international data. The source of this is VascuNet, which is a collaborative organization which looks at the results of vascular registry procedures in various different countries. These are ruptured aneurysms reported on their registries. Over on the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see here Sweden and the UK are the only 2 countries with consistent reductions in ruptured aneurysm repair over the 5 years of this investigation. These, of course, are the only 2 countries with population screening programs for abdominal aortic aneurysm. Looking at the other aspects of screening, this complicated slide looks at detection and uptake rates according to social deprivation. The population in the UK was divided into 5 quintiles. On the left-hand side of the graph, you can see the most deprived quintiles. On the right-hand side, the least deprived quintiles. Looking just at the most deprived here, you'll see the lowest uptake of screening and the highest prevalence of abdominal aortic aneurysm. So the most deprived people are the least likely to attend for screening, but the most likely men to actually have an aneurysm. And that's clearly food for thought to try and improve the results. Looking at modelling, the screening was started after it was modelled using evidence from the MASS trial. We've updated the modelling using data from much more recent times over the last few years. This looks at clinical effectiveness, the modelling, and the clinical effectiveness update suggests that around 400 ruptures are prevented by screening every year, and about 300 deaths from ruptured aneurysm. And cost effectiveness, you'd be pleased to know that using updated data to just before the pandemic, we decided to exclude the pandemic as it wasn't really representative. But up until the beginning of the pandemic, using modern data, aneurysm screening remains cost effective. So what are the conclusions? Well, in the last decade, there's been an approximate halving of the number of men treated in hospital with a rupture and a reduction in the death rate from rupture. In the screened population, those figures have fallen by 2/3. And we believe that this represents the effect of the screening programme. NHS screening programmes are effective at identifying men with aneurysms and referring them for treatment, and the risks of intervention are low. The target for a range was to make sure mortality was less than 3.5%, but in fact, screen-detected aneurysms have a mortality rate of around 1.5%. NHS abdominal aortic aneurysm screening programs remain cost-effective, despite the falling prevalence in men. There remain quality of life and inequality issues with a higher prevalence of aneurysms in the lowest socio-economical groups, which are potential targets for improvement. So what does this report mean for the screening programs themselves? Well, there's an opportunity to improve the effectiveness of screening further by focusing on the 20% of men who don't attend, by focusing on more socially deprived areas which have a higher risk of aneurysms, to improve the efficacy of the treatment pathway. And also, although this wasn't part of the review, there are more and more men in surveillance with small and medium aneurysms who, because they've been there for 10 years, are less likely to benefit from elective surgery. And these are a group needing further consideration. The risk report was presented to the UK screening programmes, and we wondered what they might consider. We thought would they stand the programme down due to the falling aneurysm prevalence? Well, that seems unlikely since it's effective. Should the aneurysm programmes continue as they currently stand, with regular effectiveness review every 5 to 10 years? Because there may well come a time when the prevalence of aneurysm reduces such that a screening ceases to be cost effective. Could the programme be modified to improve its efficiency and reduce harms? Finally, could it be expanded to consider screening for other vascular conditions and possibly include some sort of selective screening in women? All of these things will be considered by the National Screening Committee and the Four Nations teams in the future. Finally, I wish to acknowledge that I presented this on behalf of this great big team who've looked at all the data, who suggested what we should do, and have come to the conclusions together. I'm deeply grateful for them. It's also worthwhile mentioning everybody who's been involved with the screening programme, all those enthusiastic people who've delivered the programme, and they're as equally responsible for these results. And very finally, I'd like to introduce you to these two gentlemen. On the left is Brian Heather, vascular surgeon in Gloucester, who just did a screening programme and showed that it worked. His model is the same model that's used today. And on the right, Alan Scott, he was the scientist. He did the randomised mass trial, which provided the evidence, which was actually enabled the government to make it worthwhile funding, considered it was worthwhile funding the screening programme. Both of these gentlemen, I think, will be delighted with the way that the programme has been shown to be effective and to save lives. Thank you very much.